And the irony in this situation is that it's primarily those on the social and political left, those who call themselves progressives, who are pushing us in this regressive, intolerant direction. And please don't think from the case studies I just gave that I'm cherry picking or that I'm simply making ad hominem attacks. The research on this growing intolerance on the left is clear and unequivocal. I'll start with some studies that examined intolerance on university campuses. In a recent study of protests on university campuses, Dr. Sean Stevens, he's head of research at Heterodox Academy, determined that in the last 15 years, 90% of disruptions to keynote speakers were perpetrated by left and far left student groups against right-leaning speakers. In over a third of those cases, those left-leaning protesters used physical violence or threats. But if students are intolerant, it's likely they're learning it from their professors. I'll explain. Dr. Joel Inbar, he's a professor at Tilburg University, recently surveyed professors of social science on North American campuses. After determining that 95% hold left or far left worldviews, he asked about their feelings toward colleagues who held conservative or right-wing perspectives. Over a third of those liberal professors openly admitted that they would avoid hiring someone whom they knew had conservative views. About a quarter said they would purposely discriminate against research grants or publications if they came from people who they knew were conservative. And professors' intolerance is not reserved for just their conservative colleagues. It's applied to students as well. Sociologists George Yancey and Sam Reimer surveyed university professors across North America about their attitudes toward various student groups. A majority of professors admitted to being hostile to conservative Christian students, describing them as intolerant, unscientific enemies to be openly opposed. Openly opposing those you deem to be your unscientific enemies is not the kind of tolerance that you'd hope for from people who are marking your papers. Conservative Christians, by the way, were the only religious group to register anywhere near this level of negativity from their professors. All right, the research regarding leftist intolerance on campus is plentiful, but I want to squeeze just a few more studies in that will more generally look at what's going on in our society at large. First of all, if you believe the reports of the mainstream media, you'd think that only one segment of society harbors prejudice, and that one segment are conservatives. But if you believed that, you'd be categorically wrong. In a study published just last year, Peter Dito and colleagues from the University of California did a meta-analysis of 51 other peer-reviewed journal articles, and what they found was this. After aggregating all of the data from those studies, they found that liberals are just as likely to show prejudice as conservatives. Of course, the only difference is that liberal bigotry is focused against conservative ideas and conservative people. Now, let me back up. I said that was the only difference. Actually, that's not correct. There is another major difference between liberals and conservatives, and it's demonstrated through other concurrent research. We also know that in total, liberals are more likely to act on their prejudice than conservatives. It might sound like I'm now repeating myself because I've already provided evidence of this intolerant trend among liberals on university campuses. But other research shows that off campus, in society at large, liberal prejudice is more likely to lead to acts of intolerance. And of course, conservatives will act on their prejudice, but it tends to be those on the far right of the political spectrum. It's a tiny fringe that other conservatives would actually condemn. But with liberals, acting on their prejudice is not limited to the fringes of the far left. Those we'd consider mainstream liberals, for example, professionals in academia, professionals in media and government, are just as likely to imbibe the bitter waters of intolerance as those on their fringes. I could give you several examples, but I'll provide the one that's most memorable. In a nationally representative survey, the Pew Research Center asked U.S. respondents to self-identify whether they were solidly liberal or solidly conservative. Those who said they were solidly liberal were actually the most solidly illiberal in their tolerance of others. About a quarter of the solidly liberal stated that they would stop talking to someone because of a difference in political view, while only 15% of conservatives said they'd have that reaction. There's also other research that shows that conservatives, when they hear a message about free expression, actually become more open-minded to the views of others, especially their political opponents. There's even more evidence that suggests conservatives are more willing to be ideologically diverse. I'm thinking now of some work that was done by John Haidt from New York University. He surveyed a representative sample of Americans, some of them liberal, half of them conservative, and asked, what do you think of these other people? What do you think of conservatives? Tell me how they think. Because what he wanted to see was, do you understand the views of the other side? The results were clear and consistent. Though they disagreed with the ideas of their political opposites, conservatives were able to say what liberals believed and why they believed it. Conservatives were able to put themselves in the liberal shoes and articulate issues from their perspective. Conversely, liberals were less likely to have that ability. And the more liberal they were, the less likely they were to understand the thoughts and motives of conservatives. And this gets us to the very heart of why tolerance is needed now more than ever, and why it's primarily those who call themselves liberals or progressives who have the most work to do. It seems that liberals today are allowing emotional reactions to come before rational actions. Interestingly, this is the same attitude that we see in fundamentalist religious believers. Both fundamentalist religious believers and liberals dedicated to political correctness and social justice are unwilling to consider arguments that contradict their sacred beliefs. But you can see the problem with that. If you don't listen to what other people have to say, you can never hope to understand them. And if you don't understand them, you're more likely to misinterpret their motives, and you're more likely to justify hating them. It's a truism that we're more likely to hate that which we don't understand.